So the last few weeks we've been talking a lot about the mechanics of storyboarding. We've talked about dealing with scripts, we've talked about some theory in terms of character development, we've talked about building an action scene. For today's lecture, I want to talk about the notion of breaking a story. Now, this is something that you may or may not have to confront in your career, but it's something that I think you should be aware of, and a process that I think will be helpful by the end of this 9-week program. Essentially, breaking a story is when you're dealing with an idea or a notion from scratch. Whether this is your own project, something that you're developing on the side is like a short film or an independent film, or whether you find yourself in the inner circle of a $130 million huge blockbuster animated feature. Knowing how to break a story is a very useful skill. Now, there are many ways to crack open a story and figure out how to construct it. What I'm going to talk about today is sort of my approach and what I've found works really well. I'm not saying it's perfect. I think everybody's got their own approach, and depending on your personality and how you want to tell your stories, some of this stuff may apply, some of it may not. But I think it's very useful to just talk about it and try some of this stuff on to see how it works. So the term breaking story, as far as I know, genesised from the writer's room, where you get a bunch of wordsmiths together to crack open ideas for a sitcom. But that term certainly also applies to us storyboard artists. Now basically, it's the process of taking an idea back into the shop, opening it up, taking the pieces out, giving it a new coat of paint, polishing it up, and trying to hone down to the crispest based element of that idea. And it's called breaking because it's a thought experiment where you are going to go through all the different elements of that story and nothing is deemed sacred. This is where that term "you have to kill your babies" come from, because when you're trying to hone down to that base idea, sometimes you got to let go of stuff that you love. Now, in order to determine what to keep and what to let go and what to hone and what to polish, elements of your story are going to be challenged. Elements such as your character relationships, your plot points, and the overall structure of your storytelling. In a lot of ways, it is painful, and this process is a lot like an earthquake. You're knocking down buildings, you're knocking down structures, you're upheaving things that are not meant to be upheaved. But if you allow the process to go through, and if you trust that on the B side, you're going to be able to rebuild it into a shining new empire. Now, one of the things you got to watch out for when you start this process of splitting open your story is you want to make sure that you don't end up spinning. Now, spinning is essentially when you start to go around in a circle and you lose focus as to what your overall goal is for splitting open your story. Because the truth of the matter is, you can look at an idea as subjective as a story point from 100 different angles, and you can approach that idea from probably 1,000,000 different directions, all depending on which way the wind's blowing at the moment that you're talking about that element. Now, one of the things that you must try to hang on to is you have to maintain a focus upon your primary idea, as in, why did you discover this story in the first place? Now, what that primary idea is essentially the theme. Now, I mean, just to break it down, the theme is the broad idea of the story. And quite often, it's within the theme where the message is contained. Now, what are you saying about life, society, or human nature? That's the very base element of your craft. As a storyteller, it is the core idea that you wish to communicate. Now, if you do happen to lose focus on your theme, I want you to know that it's common. And if you find yourself spinning, I want you to know it happens to all of us. It happens all the time. That's really part of the job. And the first thing you must do when you lose focus of your theme is don't panic. Step back. Get away from the project for half a day. Go for a walk to a coffee shop. Go talk to somebody who's got no relationship to it. Go walk your dog. Go find a tree and hug it. Whatever it takes to kind of clear your mind so that you can remind yourself about the primary idea and bring that theme back into focus. Because ultimately, every element of your story is going to drive towards that theme. That being your characters, your plot points, your setting, your tone. Every component of that story has got to serve that theme. And that's essentially what you're doing when you're breaking a story. You're opening it up and you're making sure that everything is pointing in the right direction. So this past weekend I just saw Kung Fu Panda in the theaters, which is going to of course date this lesson, but whatever. And I imagine that the story crew in that project had a strenuous job in keeping the story focused on the theme, or essentially Po's journey. If you haven't seen the movie, Po is the panda. And he's sort of an out-of-shape, slobby guy who's working in a noodle restaurant, and his destiny is to become a great kung fu master, but before he can do that, he's got to learn to believe in himself. That's the core element of the story that I took away. And the difficulty is that you had all these other great characters that surrounded Po. There was the Fantastic Five, there was his sensei, there was the antagonist, the villain, and they're all really fantastic, and you got Kung Fu, which is really interesting. But I think the filmmakers were successful in making sure that the character that you needed to be the most invested in was Po. And I think almost to the detriment of the secondary characters who were somewhat anemic in the story, they made sure that they drove all the main focus right towards Po's journey. So even though the secondary characters, when you walk out of the theater, don't really mean anything to you, which is a flaw, that's a serious flaw, you're still satisfied with the film because Po is so appealing. For me, I mean, I walked out of there and I was really, I could analyze the film, I could think about it, but the good feeling that I had came from the fact that I got what I wanted from that main character. So I have to give kudos to that story crew, because I know how tough it is. Now, I've been working on this film right now, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. This is the cover of the book. And I can't tell you how many times we've split that story open, cracked it, pulled all the pieces out, and tried to make sure that our characters and our settings and our ideas and our set pieces are all serving our theme. It is really hard, and I can only hope when the film does eventually come out, we've succeeded in doing that. So, every time we come to a benchmark, we get a little closer, and I think as we work through it, we slip, and then we get a little closer, and we work through it, and we slip, and we get a little closer, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, if you ask me, Chris, when exactly is the right time to break open a story? Well, I would argue that the process actually begins at conception, when that idea first plants itself in your mind. However, at the birth of the idea, it's important not to overly smother it with structure and with details. What you want to do is you want to spend some time with your idea. You want to play with it. You want to squeeze it and tickle it and throw it around and teach it how to throw a football, that kind of stuff. Make the idea strong, make it real, and enjoy it. And then one day when you got a nutrient-rich pile of thoughts and notions in your big story wagon, it's time to finally plant that stuff and ultimately begin the breaking process of crafting your story into a structure.